Hi, this is Kevin.
And this is Josh. Today we're going to be talking about biogeochemical cycles. We're going to go over 3 of the most important cycles: carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. We'll be skipping the water cycle for now so that we can focus on the ones that we might be less familiar with. To begin, let's dissect the term biogeochemical cycle. Bio, that means it's going to involve the biosphere, or everything that's living. That includes us humans and other animals, plants, bacteria, and fungi. Next is geo, that's the lithosphere, or rocks, and the atmosphere, and everything non-living in between. The last part is chemical, which means that we'll be dealing with elements and compounds being transferred between different forms. Now we can define a biogeochemical cycle as the movement of substances between living things and the environment. These 2 images right here show a graph of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over time. This one shows over 400,000 years, and this one shows the concentration since 1960. Why the huge spike recently, and what are the effects of this? We'll explore those questions with the carbon cycle. Carbon is an atom that is central to life. A carbon atom can form 4 bonds with other elements, which gives us these cool ring and branch structures. Carbon in this form is also a major component of living things, as you can see here on the chart that represents what humans are made out of. So taking a look at our diagram of the carbon cycle, you'll see that our cycle has 2 main components: terrestrial and marine. Let's start with carbon in the atmosphere. In the atmosphere, carbon is going to be in 2 main forms: carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, CH4. Most of it is going to be in the form of carbon dioxide, so that's what we're going to take a look at. So plants take in atmospheric carbon in the process of photosynthesis, and this is performed by plants right here. Gaseous carbon dioxide and water is converted into sugar and oxygen. This process right here is crucial to life on Earth, since it converts light energy into the chemical energy that supports ecosystems. In terms of carbon though, what we're doing is called fixing atmospheric CO2 into carbohydrates, and this is the source of all organic biomass on Earth. When you think photosynthesis, you might think huge forests of trees, but you can't forget about the algae and plankton in the ocean that perform the same process too. Now, the opposite of photosynthesis is respiration. So let's draw our arrow from CO2 to plants. This is photosynthesis, and respiration, which is going to take the carbon from plants and move it to animals. If we're tracking the carbon here, you'll see that the carbon that we fixed during photosynthesis is being converted back into atmospheric CO2 via the process of respiration. Respiration is performed by virtually all organisms, and don't forget that plants perform both respiration and photosynthesis. So let's draw another arrow here, back out to the atmosphere. Now, not all of this carbon goes back out into the atmosphere. A good portion of the carbon is stored in the form of living organisms' biomass. When these organisms die, the carbon goes back into the soil, where it's usually stored in an inorganic form, like calcium carbonate. This process is called decomposition. Now, during this process of decomposition, microbes in the soil, so we have bacteria and fungi here, they do their job and digest these organisms and release CO2 back out into the atmosphere. Now let's move on to the second half of the carbon cycle, which is going to take place in the oceans. We can divide the ocean into 2 major layers: the surface layer, which meets the atmosphere, and the deep, scary depths of the ocean. Now, carbon in the atmosphere is going to enter the ocean through 2 main mechanisms. One is dissolved carbon from rivers being deposited into the ocean, but the most common way for carbon to enter the ocean is through the dissolution of atmospheric CO2. Naturally, we have equilibrium between the surface layer of the ocean and the atmosphere, where carbon dioxide is being exchanged between the air and the sea, and we call this the air-sea gas exchange. Air-sea gas exchange. So where does all this carbon go? Now, through the same process of photosynthesis, it's converted into organic carbon, which moves through the ocean food chain, just like how we saw it happening on land. Or gaseous carbon dioxide is going to react with seawater to form calcium carbonate, which forms the hard shells of marine organisms like this coral right here. So CO2 in the oceans is an example of carbon sequestration. carbon sequestration, which involves the long-term storage of atmospheric carbon. So the oceans are a major carbon reservoir. Currently, storing carbon in the oceans by encouraging phytoplankton growth is one solution people are considering to curb the effects of climate change. Now let's go back to our reaction of CO2 and seawater. We see that carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid. Now let's demonstrate this. So carbon dioxide reacts with seawater and it's going to form carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. And we're just going to draw these double-sided arrows here to show that this is in equilibrium and it goes either way. And this carbonic acid, since it's an acid, is going to dissociate to form hydrogen ion and HCO3 minus, which is bicarbonate. But we're not done here because we still have one more hydrogen, so that's also going to dissociate, I'm just going to draw another arrow here, running out of space, into another hydrogen ion and the carbonate atom. So what happens when we have these hydrogen ions in the water? If you'll recall, the definition of an acid is based on the concentration of H plus ions. So as the carbon dioxide reacts with seawater, we're producing this acid, and this is going to contribute to the decreased pH of the ocean. And so if we look at our pH scale here, once we have more H plus ions coming into the ocean, this is going to shift it from around neutral to a bit more acidic. And this can have disastrous consequences on marine organisms, and it makes it more difficult for hard-shelled organisms like this coral over here to build their skeletons. Now let's look at a process that's similar to respiration called combustion. So pull our respiration again. When you hear the word combustion, you might think about what's going on in your car in its internal combustion engine. And we tend to think of fossil fuels as being dinosaur juice, but it's more appropriate to say that our coal, petroleum, and natural gas came from aquatic plankton, or plants that died millions of years ago and under heat and pressure decomposed and formed the hydrocarbons that we use for energy today. So here, right next to our decomposition, is a diagram of coal formation. So as you can see, with lots of heat, pressure, and time, these living organisms get buried, compacted, and they form these fossil fuels. So what happens when the concentration of atmospheric CO2 increases? So how do we increase the concentration of atmospheric CO2? The major way we humans have been affecting this is through the burning of these fossil fuels. Remember, the carbon that was stored in these organisms is now stored in the form of fossil fuels, and that, when we burn it to produce energy or fuel our cars, is going to release CO2 back out into the atmosphere, and that's going to increase the concentration of atmospheric CO2. You're probably familiar with the greenhouse effect, where greenhouse gases like CO2 trap heat into the atmosphere, which warms the Earth. This is exactly what's going on. So if we go back to our graph of atmospheric CO2 concentration, over time you'll see a sharp increase from about 1850 onwards, and that's going to be the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning more fossil fuels, first coal and then later petroleum, which again released CO2 back out into the atmosphere. So as with all of the cycles that we're going to look at today, we humans can play a pretty big role in altering the cycle's natural balance. What do fertilizer and bombs have in common? During World War II, the government produced huge quantities of ammonium nitrate to be used in bombs. But when the war ended, they were left with the problem of what to do with all of this leftover bomb material. The solution? Let's use it to fertilize our crops. After all, crops need nitrogen too. So in the years following the war, farmers began adding ammonia to their fields. Other countries soon followed, and what we saw were dramatic increases in crop yields. This being one of the factors that led to the Green Revolution and the explosive population growth of the 20th century. Since nitrogen is found in nucleic acids and amino acids, the stability of the nitrogen cycle on Earth is essential to life. We'll start our explanation of the nitrogen cycle in the atmosphere. Nitrogen gas is a diatomic molecule, which gives it a chemical formula of N2. It makes up an overwhelming majority of the Earth's atmosphere, at 78%, with oxygen making up only 21% in comparison. Despite making up such a huge portion of the air around us, nitrogen in this form is largely unusable for life. Through nitrogen fixation, atmospheric nitrogen is converted into ammonia. Lightning can fix some nitrogen, but the majority of atmospheric nitrogen is converted by bacteria. There are two main types of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The first is cyanobacteria, which can be found in oceans, and the second is the bacteria found in symbiosis in legume roots. This type of bacteria includes the genus Rhizobium. So through fixation, atmospheric nitrogen is converted into molecules that can be used up by living organisms. But at this point, plants are still unable to use this nitrogen. It's through another step of the nitrogen cycle, nitrification, that other bacteria in the soil convert ammonia into first nitrites, NO2-, and then nitrates, NO3-. Nitrite can be toxic to plants, but nitrate is an essential nutrient. One way to remember this is that nitrate has 8 in it, so think of plants as eating nitrate. Nitrosomonas are the bacteria that convert ammonia into nitrites. Then Nitrobacter, which you might guess is another bacteria, convert nitrites into usable nitrates. It's in nitrate form that nitrogen can cause eutrophication, a problem that we'll talk about more with the phosphorus cycle. To recap, nitrification is the process of converting ammonia or ammonium into nitrites and then nitrates. Once in nitrate form, plants are able to assimilate NO3- and NH4+ into organic compounds for their use in building proteins or DNA molecules. Assimilation is the process of plants taking in the nitrogen in their environment and using it to build organic molecules. At this point, let's make a distinction between ammonia and ammonium. Ammonia is a neutral molecule, while ammonium is an ion with a charge of 1+, since it has an extra hydrogen. Next, nitrogen is distributed through ingestion when animals eat plants. Some nitrogen is rapidly returned to the soil through excretion. Ultimately, the nitrogen that was assimilated becomes ammonia after the death of those plants or animals through the work of decomposers like bacteria and fungi. In ammonification, decomposers convert the nitrogen from organisms back into ammonia, NH3, returning this nitrogen back into the soil. The cycle then continues with our nitrosomonas and nitrobacter converting this ammonia back into nitrites or nitrates. In the final step, denitrification, denitrifying bacteria convert nitrates back into atmospheric nitrogen. And this takes us back to the beginning of the nitrogen cycle. This right here is a picture of the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, which is an area of low oxygen that's harmful to marine life. Each summer, agricultural and sewage treatment from the Mississippi River imparts excess nutrients into the Gulf, creating this dead zone that's roughly the size of New Jersey. We're going to talk more about this process, cultural eutrophication, with the phosphorus cycle. The element of phosphorus is absolutely essential for the existence of life because it's needed for energy-storing molecules like ATP, and it partially makes up biomolecules like lipids and DNA. Plants mainly absorb phosphorus through the soil, and animals absorb phosphorus by eating plants. As a result, the rare amounts of phosphorus in the soil act as a limiting factor in the growth of plants, and it often limits crop yields as well. This is why humans apply fertilizers to the soil that include phosphates, a compound that includes phosphorus and improves plant growth. Unlike carbon or nitrogen, phosphorus in the phosphorus cycle is never found in a gaseous state. Because of this, there's no atmospheric step involved in the cycle. We'll start our explanation instead with the weathering process. When a rock is either broken down mechanically, like through frost shattering, or chemically, like through water-dissolving limestone. Many rocks contain phosphate ions and other minerals, and these inorganic phosphates are carried to soil or water through ice, water, wind, or gravity. The phosphorus that ends up in the soil is used by plants through absorption. Plants incorporate the inorganic phosphates and utilize them for biomolecules, converting them into organic phosphates, which are phosphates that are found in the form of biomolecules. Some of these organic phosphates are eaten by animals. These organic phosphates are returned to the soil when plants or animals die and decay. The organic phosphates of the soil are then transformed back into inorganic form, which is the form that's usable for plants. This is done by bacteria and fungi. So this process here of transforming organic phosphates into inorganic form is called mineralization. Some of the inorganic phosphates from the rocks and also from soil will end up being sent to waterways, and these molecules will end up in the ocean. These inorganic phosphates eventually begin accumulating in sediments in the ocean, which then eventually form rocks. This takes us back to the beginning of the cycle with the weathering of the rocks that releases inorganic phosphates. Phosphates, along with nitrates, are both nutrients that are required for plant growth. However, when an excess of phosphates or nitrates occur, especially after accumulation in a body of water, too much plant growth can happen, causing a phenomenon known as eutrophication. Cultural eutrophication occurs when the causes of eutrophication are from human activity, like fertilizer runoff or raw sewage. During the eutrophication process, the excessive amount of phosphates and nitrates supply the rapid growth of algae, causing algae blooms across the surface of the water. Over time, the spread of algal blooms reduces the amount of light penetration into the water and reduces dissolved oxygen content. Since animals beneath the water require oxygen to respirate, the development of algal blooms ends up disrupting the food web and potentially the entire ecosystem. As the human population continues to increase, we have to be cautious of the effects of agriculture on the disposal of our sewage. Otherwise, we risk upsetting the phosphorus cycle, which, as you've seen, is essential to life on Earth.